in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, a gunshot echoed through the manicured calm of the Tuileries gardens, slicing through the heart of Parisian elegance. No one saw the killer's hand, but everyone wore a mask. And as the police scrambled, one man adjusted his cuffs, narrowed his eyes, and whispered, "This, mon ami, is no ordinary crime." I have always maintained that my friend, Hercule Poirot, possesses an almost supernatural ability to sense when the ordinary world is about to be disturbed by the extraordinary. On that particular morning in Paris, the 15th of October, to be precise, I observed him adjusting his tie no fewer than 6 times before the mirror in our hotel suite, his fingers working with the meticulous precision of a watchmaker. "Mon ami," he murmured, switching to French as he invariably did when the atmosphere pleased him. "Paris, she welcomes us with perfect weather for my lecture this afternoon." Our rooms at the Hotel Muris commanded a splendid view of the Tuileries gardens, where the autumn leaves created a tapestry of gold and crimson beneath the morning sun. Poirot had been invited to address the International Conference on Criminal Psychology, a gathering of distinguished minds from across Europe. I confess, I felt rather proud to be accompanying him on such an illustrious occasion. "The subject of your paper?" I ventured, settling into the comfortable chair by the window. "The criminal mind and its relationship to guilt. Rather fascinating stuff, isn't it?" Poirot's reflection caught my eye in the mirror. His hands had stilled momentarily on his mustaches, those magnificent whiskers that were the pride of his existence. "Precisely, Hastings' guilt. She is the most curious of emotions. Sometimes she drives a man to confession, sometimes to madness, and sometimes," he paused, his gray eyes growing thoughtful, "sometimes she drives him to acts most unexpected." At precisely 9 o'clock, there came a sharp rap upon our door. I rose to answer it, expecting perhaps the porter with our breakfast, but instead found myself face to face with a tall, thin man in the uniform of the Charite. His angular features bore the harried expression of one who has been awake far longer than is comfortable. "Inspector Giroux," the man announced, removing his cap with a perfunctory bow. "I seek Monsieur Poirot." "Voila, Inspector." Poirot called from across the room, having completed his morning toilette. "You find me at your service. Pray enter." Inspector Giroux stepped into our sitting room, his eyes darting nervously about the elegant furnishings. I observed him take particular note of Poirot's immaculate appearance, the perfectly pressed suit, the gleaming patent leather shoes, the precise arrangement of his pocket handkerchief. "Monsieur Poirot," Giroux began, his accent thick with the inflections of southern France. "Forgive this early intrusion, but circumstances most unusual have arisen. A death has occurred which—" He hesitated, clearly struggling with some internal debate. "As you were, Inspector," Poirot commanded gently, gesturing toward the sofa. "Captain Hastings, perhaps you would be so kind as to ring for coffee? Inspector Giroux has the appearance of a man who has had little sleep and much coffee already. But one more cup, it cannot harm." I watched Giroux settle himself carefully, as though the elegant furniture might collapse beneath him. There was something in his manner, a peculiar mixture of professional duty and personal reluctance, that aroused my curiosity considerably. "The victim," Giroux continued, accepting the coffee cup I offered, "is one Dr. Lucien Marchand, a psychoanalyst of considerable reputation here in Paris. His clientele—" He glanced at Poirot. "They are, how shall I say, the most distinguished members of society." Poirot had seated himself opposite our visitor, his posture erect, his hands placed precisely upon his knees. I noticed the slight tilt of his head that invariably signaled his complete attention. "The circumstances of death?" Poirot inquired, his tone carefully neutral. "Most tragic," Giroux replied, setting down his cup with trembling fingers. "Dr. Marchand was discovered at dawn this morning, floating in the ornamental fountain of the Tuileries gardens. He was fully clothed, save for his shoes, which we found arranged neatly upon the fountain's edge." I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. The Tuileries, so close to our hotel that we could observe the gardens from our very windows. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured. "And the cause of death?" "Drowning, without question." "But, Monsieur Poirot—" Giroux leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. There is something most peculiar. From his coat pocket, the inspector withdrew a small evidence envelope. Through the transparent material, I could see what appeared to be a soggy scrap of paper. A suicide note, I suggested. Giroux shook his head slowly. If only it were so simple, Captain Hastings. The paper bears but a single word, written in ink that has run somewhat from the water. The word is guilt. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. I found myself studying Poirot's expression, noting the way his eyes had grown very still and watchful. His fingers, I observed, had begun their familiar drumming against his knee, a sure sign that his remarkable brain had already begun to work upon the puzzle. Très bien, Poirot said at length. And your theory, Inspector Giroux? The Frenchman shifted uncomfortably. The obvious conclusion would be suicide, naturally. A man consumed by guilt over some professional or personal failing. But he gestured helplessly with his hands. There are certain aspects of the case that trouble me greatly, such as the positioning of the body. For one thing, Dr. Marchand was found floating face upward, his arms spread wide, almost as though he were embracing the sky. Not the attitude one typically observes in cases of self-destruction. I watched Poirot's mustaches twitch, almost imperceptibly, a sign I had learned to recognize as indicating intense interest, carefully concealed. And the handwriting upon the paper? Giroux continued. While certainly that of Dr. Marchand, it appears to have been written with considerable effort, almost as though. He paused, clearly reluctant to voice his thoughts, as though the hand that wrote it was not entirely willing. Poirot suggested quietly, exactment. Poirot rose from his chair with fluid grace, crossing to the window that overlooked the gardens. I joined him there, following his gaze toward the ornamental fountain that sparkled like a jewel in the morning sunlight. From our vantage point, we could observe the small crowd of officials still gathered around the scene. Inspector Giroux, Poirot said, without turning from the window, I believe my lecture on criminal psychology must wait for another day. This case, she presents certain features that intrigue Poirot considerably. The relief in Giroux's voice was palpable. Then, you will assist us, monsieur? Poirot adjusted his tie once more, a gesture I recognized as his preparation for action. But first, I should like to examine the scene with my own eyes, and perhaps to learn more of this Dr. Marchand, and his particular methods of treating the troubles of the mind. As Inspector Giroux departed, having arranged to collect us within the hour, I found myself studying my friend's profile against the window. There was something in his expression, an alertness, a sense of anticipation, that suggested this case had already captured his imagination, in a way that few others ever had. An hour later, Inspector Gérard's motorcar delivered us through the bustling streets of Paris to the Rue de Rivoli. The morning traffic had reached its peak, with elegant carriages competing for space alongside the newer motor vehicles that were rapidly transforming the character of the city. Poirot sat beside me in contemplative silence, his gloved hands folded precisely in his lap, his keen eyes observing the pedestrians with that peculiar intensity one had come to recognize as the preliminary stages of detection. Voila, gentlemen, Inspector Gérard announced, as we drew up before an imposing building of cream-colored stone, the consulting rooms of Dr. Lucien Marchand. The structure before us spoke of quiet prosperity and professional distinction. 5 stories of perfectly maintained stonework rose above a series of shops at street level, while wrought iron balconies adorned each floor with delicate precision. A discreet brass nameplate beside the entrance bore the simple inscription, Dr. L. Marchand, psychoanalyst, 3rd floor. Très respectable, Poirot murmured, tilting his head slightly as he examined the building's facade. Dr. Marchand, he clearly commanded considerable fees for his services. We ascended the carpeted staircase in single file, our footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner that spoke of expense spared nowhere in the building's appointments. The 3rd floor landing opened onto a small anteroom, furnished with leather chairs and mahogany side tables bearing the latest issues of Le Figaro and L'Illustration. Through tall windows, filtered sunlight cast geometric patterns across the polished parquet floor. Inspector Gérard rapped sharply upon the frosted glass door marked private, and after a moment's pause, We were admitted by a woman of perhaps 45 years. She was dressed in morning black, her dark hair pulled severely back from a face that bore the unmistakable marks of recent distress. "Messrs," she said, her voice carefully controlled, despite the tremor I detected beneath the surface. "I am Madame Dubois, Dr. Marchand's secretary. Inspector Gerard informed me of your arrival." Poirot removed his hat with ceremonial precision. "Madam, permit me to express our condolences upon the loss of your employer. You worked closely with the doctor, N.S.C. Pa." "For 12 years, monsieur," Madame Dubois replied, dabbing at her eyes with a small handkerchief. "Dr. Marchand. He was a man of extraordinary dedication to his patients." She led us through a reception area appointed with the same expensive taste we had observed throughout the building. Burgundy leather chairs were arranged in intimate groupings, while oil paintings in gilded frames depicted tranquil pastoral scenes. The atmosphere suggested discretion and confidentiality, essential qualities, I reflected, in a practice devoted to the most private troubles of the human mind. "If you would follow me to the consulting room," Madame Dubois continued, producing a key from her reticule. "I have taken the liberty of preparing the doctor's files, as Inspector Gerard requested." The consulting room itself was a masterpiece of professional psychology. Rich burgundy curtains framed windows that offered a view of the street below, while bookcases lined the walls from floor to ceiling. I observed titles in French, German, and English, works by Freud, Jung, and other pioneers in the field of mental analysis. A large desk dominated one corner of the room, its leather surface adorned with the usual professional paraphernalia: inkwell, blotter, appointment calendar, and a curious bronze figurine of a human head marked with phrenological divisions. But it was toward the filing cabinet that Poirot's attention immediately directed itself. The tall mahogany structure stood against the far wall, its multiple drawers bearing small brass nameplates. Several of these drawers stood partially open, their contents clearly disturbed. "Tiens," he observed quietly, approaching the cabinet with his characteristic mincing step. "It would appear that Dr. Marchand's files have received some attention recently." Madame Dubois wrung her hands nervously. "Yes, monsieur. That is precisely what has troubled me so greatly. When I arrived this morning, before I learned of the terrible news, I discovered that several patient files were missing entirely." "Missing?" Inspector Gerard stepped forward, his notebook appearing in his hand with practiced efficiency. "You are certain of this, madam?" "Absolutely," she replied, with increasing agitation. "Dr. Marchand was most particular about his filing system. Each patient possessed a complete dossier containing session notes, personal history, and psychological assessments. Yet this morning I found gaps, actual physical gaps, where certain files should have been." I watched Poirot's fingers trace the edge of one empty file slot, his expression thoughtful. "These missing files, Madame Dubois, were they patients of recent attendance? Or perhaps those from some years past?" "Recent, monsieur. Very recent indeed." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And if I may say so, they were among Dr. Marchand's most challenging cases." "Ah," Poirot murmured, his gray eyes growing very alert. "Challenging? In what particular manner?" Madame Dubois glanced nervously toward Inspector Gerard before responding. Dr. Marchand had been working on a special project. A book, you understand. He intended to publish a collection of case studies demonstrating his innovative therapeutic techniques. The missing files belonged to patients he had selected for inclusion in this work. "And these patients," I interjected, "they were aware of Dr. Marchand's intentions to publish their cases?" The secretary's hesitation was answer enough, though she eventually nodded, reluctantly. The doctor believed that scientific advancement sometimes required difficult decisions. He was most careful to disguise identifying details, naturally, but the psychological profiles would remain intact. Poirot had moved to examine the desk more closely, his keen eyes taking in every detail of its surface. I observed him pause over the appointment calendar, his finger tracing entries with the delicate touch of a musician at the keyboard. "The final appointments," he said suddenly. "Those recorded for the days immediately preceding Dr. Marchand's death. What can you tell us of these?" Madame Du Bois approached the desk with obvious reluctance. There were 3 patients scheduled during the final week. Each represented a cornerstone of the doctor's research, cases that had consumed his attention for months. Their names? Inspector Gerard inquired, his pen poised above his notebook. Comtesse Elise d'Avron, Mademoiselle Odette Blanche, and Monsieur Julien Moreau. She pronounced each name with the careful precision of one who had spoken them countless times in the context of appointment scheduling. All 3 had been undergoing intensive analysis. All 3 had exhibited unusual psychological phenomena. Poirot straightened from his examination of the desk, his mustaches twitching with what I recognized as suppressed excitement. Unusual phenomena, madam? Perhaps you would elaborate upon this most intriguing observation. Dreams, monsieur, she replied, her voice growing even quieter. Recurring dreams of a most disturbing nature. Dr. Marchand had become convinced that these dreams represented breakthrough manifestations of suppressed psychological conflicts. He documented them extensively. And these documentations? Poirot pressed gently. They too have disappeared with the patient files? Madame Du Bois nodded miserably. Everything, monsieur. Months of detailed observations, interpretations, therapeutic strategies, all vanished, as though they had never existed. The silence that followed this revelation was heavy with implication. I found myself studying the empty file cabinet with new understanding, recognizing it now as the scene of a secondary crime, one that might prove as significant as the murder itself. Inspector Gerard closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Madame Du Bois, we shall require the addresses of these 3 patients, along with any additional information you can provide about their treatment. As the secretary busied herself with preparing the requested information, Poirot moved to stand before the tall windows, gazing down at the street below with that peculiar stillness that invariably preceded his most profound observations. I positioned myself beside him, noting how his reflection in the glass seemed almost to merge with the bustling life of Paris beyond. The Hôtel de Varennes occupied an entire block in the prestigious 7th arrondissement, its imposing facade speaking of centuries of aristocratic privilege. As our motor car turned into the courtyard, through wrought iron gates that bore the family coat of arms, I could not help but reflect upon the dramatic contrast between this bastion of old French nobility and the modern world of psychological analysis we had just departed. Magnifique, Poirot observed quietly, his eyes taking in the perfect symmetry of the classical architecture. The Comtesse inhabits a world where tradition and order reign supreme. Most interesting, considering the nature of her psychological disturbances. Inspector Guiraud had provided us with a brief synopsis during our journey across the city. Comtesse Elise de Varennes, widow of the late Henri de Varennes, had been consulting Dr. Marchand for approximately 6 months regarding recurring nightmares of exceptional violence and clarity. Her sessions had been scheduled weekly, always at precisely 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoons. A liveried footman admitted us to an entrance hall that spoke of understated magnificence. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, while portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilt frames. Every surface gleamed with the kind of meticulous care that only substantial wealth could maintain. Madame la Comtesse will receive you in the blue salon, the footman announced with the formal precision of long training. If you would follow me, messieurs. The blue salon proved to be a chamber of exquisite taste, its walls covered in silk damask of the palest azure. Furniture of the Louis XVI period was arranged with mathematical precision, while Sèvres porcelain and objets d'art occupied their designated positions with museum-like exactitude. Tall windows, draped in matching blue silk, overlooked perfectly manicured gardens, where every hedge and flower bed maintained its prescribed geometric form. Comtesse Elise de Varennes rose to greet us with the fluid grace of one born to command social situations. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, though her aristocratic bearing and careful grooming made precise age difficult to determine. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure, while her mourning dress of deepest black silk spoke of perpetual grief for her deceased husband. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, substantial stones that proclaimed wealth as surely as her surroundings. "Gentlemen," she said, extending a gloved hand with practiced elegance, "Inspector Poirot informed me of your wish to discuss poor Dr. Martian's tragic death. Please do be seated." I observed Poirot study the Countess with that peculiar intensity he reserved for particularly intriguing specimens. His bow was ceremonially deep, his manner deferential yet penetrating. "Madame la Comtesse," he began, settling himself carefully in the offered chair, "we are most grateful for your cooperation in this difficult matter. Perhaps you would tell us of your association with Dr. Marchand." A shadow crossed the Countess's perfectly composed features. "Dr. Marchand was recommended to me by my physician, Dr. Beaulieu, when I began experiencing difficulties with sleep. Recurring dreams of a most disturbing nature had begun to affect my daily life." "These dreams," Poirot inquired gently, "would you describe them as unusual in their content or in their frequency?" The Countess's hands, I noted, had begun to work nervously at the fabric of her skirt, despite her outward composure. "They were violent, monsieur. Dreams of blood and struggle, of masked figures moving through darkened corridors. Always there was the sensation of hands around my throat, of fighting for breath that would not come." "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured sympathetically. "Most distressing indeed. And these dreams, they occurred with regularity?" "Nightly," she replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "For months, I scarcely dared close my eyes. Dr. Marchand assured me that through analysis, we could discover the psychological roots of these manifestations." I watched Poirot's fingers drum silently against the arm of his chair, a gesture I recognized as indicating intense concentration. "And did Dr. Marchand succeed in discovering these roots, madam?" The Countess hesitated, her perfectly controlled mask slipping almost imperceptibly. "He had certain theories, suggestions about suppressed memories, childhood traumas, but I found his methods increasingly invasive." "Invasive in what manner?" Inspector Poirot interjected, his notebook appearing with practiced efficiency. "He wished to explore areas of my past that seemed entirely irrelevant to my condition," she replied, her tone tinged with distaste. "My marriage, my relationship with my late husband, family secrets that had no bearing upon my sleep disturbances." Poirot had risen from his chair and was now examining the various ornaments arranged upon the mantelpiece. I observed him pause before a particularly fine example of Meissen porcelain, a shepherdess whose delicate features seemed almost alive in the afternoon light. "Charmant," he murmured, adjusting the figurine's position by perhaps half an inch. "You maintain perfect order in your household, Madame la Comtesse, every object in its designated place, every detail attended to with meticulous care." I watched the Countess's reaction to this seemingly innocent observation with growing fascination. Her eyes had fixed upon the repositioned figurine with an intensity that seemed almost painful. Her hands, previously still, began to work at her gloves with increasing agitation. "Order is essential," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Without order, there's only chaos, only nightmare." Poirot had moved to a small side table where a collection of silver-framed photographs was arranged with geometric precision. His examination of these mementos appeared casual, yet I detected the same methodical attention he brought to the most crucial clues. "Your late husband," he observed, indicating a formal portrait of a distinguished gentleman in military uniform. "He was a man of regular habits, n'est-ce pas?" "He was a soldier," the Countess replied, her tone growing defensive. Discipline and routine were the foundation of his character. He expected the same standards from those around him. "Naturellement," Poirot agreed, replacing the photograph with deliberate carelessness, not quite in its original position. "And tell me, madam, during your final session with Dr. Marchand, did he discuss any particular breakthrough in your treatment?" The Countess's composure, already strained, began to fragment visibly. Her gaze darted between the displaced photograph and the repositioned figurine, while her breathing grew increasingly shallow. "He claimed to have discovered the source of my dreams," she whispered, her carefully modulated voice cracking with emotion. "But his theories were monstrous. Impossible. He suggested that my nightmares were memories, actual memories of violence I had witnessed or participated in. And what was your response to this suggestion? Poirot asked, his tone remaining carefully neutral despite the explosive nature of her revelation. I terminated my sessions immediately, she declared, rising abruptly from her chair. Dr. Marchand had clearly allowed his imagination to overcome his professional judgment. The idea that I could have been involved in any form of violence was utterly absurd. I observed Poirot's eyes narrow slightly as he studied the Comtesse's agitated state. With movements that appeared unconscious, she had begun straightening various objects throughout the room, adjusting the angle of a book here, repositioning a vase there, her compulsive need for order overwhelming her aristocratic restraint. Of course, Poirot agreed soothingly. Such suggestions must have been deeply offensive to a person of your refinement. Tell me, madam, on the night of Dr. Malshaw's death, October the 14th, you were at home, I presume? Certainly, she replied without hesitation. I retired early, as is my custom. My maid, Celeste, can confirm this. I have not set foot in the Tuileries gardens for many years. The vehemence of this denial struck me as curious, given that no one had specifically mentioned the gardens as being connected to her movements. Poirot, I noted, had caught this slip as well, his mustaches twitching almost imperceptibly. The Tuileries, he mused aloud. Such beautiful gardens. Yet you avoid them, madam. They hold unpleasant associations, she replied stiffly, her hands continuing their compulsive rearrangement of the room's contents, places where one's peace of mind might be disturbed. Ah, Poirot nodded with apparent understanding. And your dreams on that particular night, were they of the usual character? The Countess froze in the act of adjusting a small bronze clock. When she turned to face us, her aristocratic mask had slipped entirely, revealing a face marked by genuine terror. That night, she whispered, I dreamed of drowning, of dark water closing over my head, while faceless figures watched from the shore. It was the first time water had featured in my nightmares, and the clarity was unbearable. The silence that followed this admission was profound. I found myself studying the Countess's pale features, noting the way her carefully applied cosmetics could not entirely disguise the dark circles beneath her eyes, or the fine lines of strain around her mouth. The haberdashery shop of Dubois-Fils occupied a narrow building in the Marais district, its modest frontage a stark contrast to the aristocratic grandeur we had just departed. Through the dusty windows, I could observe bolts of fabric arranged with military precision, while spools of thread created rainbow patterns against the dark wood shelving. A small brass bell announced our entrance with a cheerful tinkle, one that seemed oddly out of place given the gravity of our mission. Mademoiselle Blanc resides above the shop. Inspector Giroux informed us quietly as we paused in the cramped interior. She has worked here for 7 years, according to the proprietor. An exemplary employee, though somewhat particular in her habits. The shopkeeper, a wizened man with ink-stained fingers, emerged from behind his counter with obvious curiosity. Upon learning our purpose, he directed us toward a narrow staircase that led to the upper floors, his expression growing troubled as he watched our ascent. Pauvre petite, I heard him mutter. Always washing, always cleaning. Such devotion to purity is not natural in one so young. The staircase opened onto a small landing where a single door bore a modest nameplate reading, Eau Blanc. Poirot's knock was answered almost immediately, as though our arrival had been anxiously anticipated. The young woman who admitted us was perhaps 25 years of age, with pale brown hair pulled severely back from a face that bore the translucent quality of one who spends little time in sunlight. Messrs, she said, her voice carrying the flat tones of careful control. Inspector Giroux's message informed me of your visit. Please enter quickly. The corridor harbors so much dust. I followed Poirot into what could only be described as the most immaculately maintained living space I had ever encountered. Every surface gleamed with the results of obsessive attention, while the very air seemed to carry the astringent scent of carbolic soap and bleaching powder. The furniture, though modest in quality, was arranged with geometric precision, each piece occupying its designated position with mathematical exactitude. Mademoiselle Blanc herself presented an appearance of almost clinical cleanliness. Her simple gray dress showed no trace of wrinkle or stain, while her hands, which I observed her washing no fewer than 3 times during our brief arrival, were scrubbed to a painful-looking pinkness. "Please be seated," she instructed, indicating chairs that had obviously been prepared for our visit with fresh antimacassars. "I have taken the liberty of boiling water for tea. Everything has been sterilized, naturally." I watched Poirot settle himself carefully, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the spotless apartment. A small kitchen area occupied one corner of the main room, its surfaces gleaming white as fresh snow. Beyond an open doorway, I glimpsed a bedroom where even the bedclothes appeared to have been arranged with ruler-straight precision. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began gently, "we are investigating the tragic death of Dr. Marshall. Inspector Giroux has informed us that you were among his patients." The young woman's hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, began to work nervously at the fabric of her skirt. "Dr. Marchand was helping me with difficulties, thoughts that troubled my peace of mind, impure thoughts that required cleansing." "These thoughts?" Poirot inquired with his characteristic delicacy. "They were of what nature?" "Contamination," she replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The feeling that uncleanliness, spiritual uncleanliness, was spreading through my being like a disease. Dr. Marchand assured me that through analysis, we could identify the source of this contamination. I observed her rise suddenly from her chair and move to the small wash basin, where she began scrubbing her hands with a bar of harsh soap. The ritual was performed with the mechanical precision of long habit, each finger receiving individual attention, the nails scraped clean with a small brush. "And did Dr. Marchand succeed in identifying the source?" Poirot asked, his tone remaining carefully neutral despite the disturbing nature of her compulsions. "He claimed to have discovered memories," she said, continuing her ablutions while speaking. "Childhood experiences I had supposedly suppressed, but his theories became increasingly unclean. He suggested that my need for purification stemmed from witnessing acts of violence, perhaps even participating in them." "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured sympathetically. "Such suggestions must have been deeply distressing." Mademoiselle Blanc dried her hands on a towel that appeared to have been freshly laundered, then immediately moved to straighten objects on a nearby shelf. "More than distressing, Monsieur Poirot. Dr. Marchand himself had become contaminated by his investigations into the darker aspects of human nature. I could sense the spiritual pollution radiating from him during our final sessions." Inspector Giroux leaned forward in his chair, his notebook appearing with practiced efficiency. "When did you last see Dr. Marchand, mademoiselle?" 3 weeks ago," she replied without hesitation. "I terminated my sessions because I realized that continued contact with him would only spread the contamination further. He had become unclean in spirit, you understand, tainted by his association with mental impurities." I watched Poirot's reflection in the spotless mirror that hung above the wash basin, noting how his gray eyes had grown very still and watchful. "This spiritual contamination you perceived in Dr. Marshall, did it suggest to you that some form of cleansing might be necessary?" The young woman paused in her compulsive tidying, her pale eyes growing distant. "Water is the universal purifier, Monsieur Poirot. It washes away all forms of contamination, returning the spirit to its natural state of cleanliness. Dr. Marchand spoke often of baptism, of rebirth through immersion." "Très interessant," Poirot observed quietly. "And on the night of October the 14th, the night of Dr. Marchand's death, you were occupied in what manner?" "Cleaning," she replied with mechanical precision. "I had detected signs of contamination in my living quarters and spent the entire night in purification activities. Every surface was scrubbed, every object sterilized. The work continued until dawn." "Naturellement," Poirot nodded with apparent understanding. "Such thorough cleaning must have required considerable time and effort. You worked alone, I presume." "Purification is a solitary activity," she confirmed, moving to adjust the already perfect arrangement of cleaning supplies beneath the wash basin. "One cannot risk spreading contamination to others through casual contact. I found myself studying the array of soaps, brushes, and chemical solutions she had assembled with such care. The quantities seemed excessive, even for someone of her obvious obsessions. Enough bleaching powder to clean an entire building. Sufficient carbolic soap to sterilize a hospital ward. Your cleaning activities? Inspector Gerard inquired, his tone mild but probing. They involve the use of water, I presume. Enormous, she replied, her eyes taking on an almost dreamy quality. Water in great quantities. Hot water for scrubbing, cold water for rinsing, chemical solutions for sterilization. By dawn, every surface gleamed with perfect cleanliness. Poirot had risen from his chair and was now examining the small collection of books arranged on a shelf near the window. I observed him pause over a volume bound in white leather, a prayer book whose pages showed evidence of frequent handling. "You are a religious person, mademoiselle?" he asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity. "Cleanliness is next to godliness," she replied, with the fervor of absolute conviction. "The elimination of contamination is a sacred duty. Those who spread spiritual pollution must be cleansed, regardless of their worldly position or professional standing." The vehemence in her voice struck me as particularly significant, though I could not immediately grasp its full implications. Poirot, however, seemed to find her words deeply meaningful, his mustaches twitching in that subtle manner I had learned to recognize as indicating intense interest. "Dr. Marchand's death," he said suddenly, his voice calm but deliberate, "occurred in water, as you are no doubt aware. The symbolism of such a death, what would it suggest to someone of your spiritual sensibilities?" Mademoiselle Blanc ceased her compulsive tidying and turned to face us directly. Her pale features had taken on an expression of almost religious ecstasy, while her eyes gleamed with fanatic intensity. "Perfect purification," she whispered. "Complete immersion in the universal cleanser. Dr. Marchand's contaminated spirit was finally washed clean of all impurities. It was beautiful in its symbolic perfection." The silence that followed this extraordinary statement was heavy with implication. I found myself studying the young woman's rapt expression, noting how her typically nervous hands had grown perfectly still for the first time during our visit. Inspector Giroux closed his notebook with a decisive snap, while Poirot moved to stand before the spotless window that overlooked the narrow street below. The afternoon light filtered through glass that had obviously been cleaned to perfection, casting geometric patterns across the immaculate floor. The studio of Julien Marot occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Montagny's, its vast windows commanding an unobstructed view across the rooftops of Paris toward the distant spires of Notre Dame. As we climbed the worn wooden stairs, each step creaking ominously under our combined weight, I could detect the distinctive odor of turpentine and oil paint growing stronger with our ascent. "Voila!" Inspector Giroux announced as we reached the final landing, somewhat breathless from our exertion. "The atelier of our third suspect. Monsieur Marot is what the art critics call a promising talent, though his subjects, they are somewhat disturbing." Indeed, even before we entered the studio proper, I could observe several canvases leaning against the corridor walls. Each depicted scenes of dark water populated by pale, floating forms, human figures rendered with such ghostly indistinctness that their faces appeared as mere suggestions in the gloom. Poirot paused before one particularly striking example, his head tilted in that characteristic manner indicating intense concentration. "Most curious," he murmured, studying the painting's technique. "The artist, he possesses considerable skill. Yet notice, Hastings, how every human face lacks definition, as though the subjects were viewed through murky water." Our knock was answered by a man of perhaps 30 years, whose appearance bore the unmistakable marks of artistic temperament and psychological distress. Julien Marot was tall and gaunt, with prematurely gray hair that fell in unkempt waves to his shoulders. His clothing, a paint-stained smock over worn corduroy trousers, suggested little concern for conventional appearance, while his dark eyes held the haunted quality I associated with profound inner turmoil. "Messrs," he said, his voice carrying the husky tones of one who spent little time in ordinary conversation. "Inspector Giroux's message informed me of your visit. Please enter. though I must warn you that my studio is not arranged for formal entertaining. The studio itself was a chaos of artistic creation that stood in stark contrast to the obsessive orderliness we had observed in Mademoiselle Blank's apartment. Canvases lined every available wall space, while palettes encrusted with dried paint covered a long workbench beneath the north-facing windows. Brushes stood in glass jars like strange bouquets, their bristles stained with the colors of countless compositions. Yet, it was the view from those magnificent windows that commanded my immediate attention. The studio's elevation provided a panoramic vista of central Paris, with the Tuileries gardens spread out like a green carpet far below. From this vantage point, every path through the gardens was visible, including the ornamental fountain where Dr. Marchand had met his death. "Remarkable," Poirot observed, moving to stand before the windows. "You possess here a most comprehensive view of the city, Monsieur Moreau. The Tuileries gardens, they are particularly well observed from this position." The artist's reaction to this seemingly innocent comment was immediate and profound. His hands, which had been resting calmly at his sides, began to tremble visibly, while his pale complexion grew even more ashen. "I paint what I see," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Water has always fascinated me. Its ability to distort, to conceal, to transform the familiar into something mysterious and frightening." I followed his gaze toward a collection of paintings arranged along the eastern wall, each depicting variations on the theme of submersion. Bodies floated in dark pools, faces gazed upward through liquid veils, and always, there was that quality of dreamlike horror that marked his distinctive style. "Your sessions with Dr. Marchand?" Poirot inquired gently, settling himself carefully on a paint-stained stool. "They concerned these artistic visions, n'est-ce pas? Dr. Marchand believed that my paintings were manifestations of suppressed guilt," Moreau replied, beginning to pace the studio with nervous energy. "He theorized that I was using art to express psychological conflicts I could not confront directly." "And what was your opinion of this theory?" Inspector Giroux asked, his notebook appearing with practiced efficiency. The artist paused in his pacing, his dark eyes growing distant with memory. "Initially, I found his analysis compelling. He helped me understand that my obsession with drowning figures might represent a desire for purification, for washing away the accumulated guilt of human existence." "Trace philosophique," Poirot murmured, his keen gaze taking in every detail of the artist's agitated state. "But this understanding, it did not bring you peace of mind." "On the contrary," Moreau replied with bitter intensity. "Dr. Marchand's sessions made everything worse. He encouraged me to explore the darkest recesses of my psyche, to confront memories and desires I had spent years trying to suppress. By the end, I felt as though I were drowning in my own guilt." I observed Poirot's fingers drum silently against his knee, a gesture indicating that some crucial piece of information was beginning to fall into place. "These memories Dr. Marchand helped you uncover, they were of what nature?" "Violence," the artist whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Acts of brutality I had witnessed, participated in, or simply imagined with such vividness that the distinction became meaningless. Dr. Marchand insisted that confronting these memories was essential for my artistic development. And your final session with him?" Poirot pressed gently. Moreau moved to stand before his easel, where a half-finished canvas depicted a figure floating face upward in dark water, arms spread wide in an attitude of surrender or embrace. He told me that I had become a vessel for collective guilt, that my paintings were messages from the universal unconscious, demanding acknowledgement of humanity's capacity for evil. "Mon Dieu!" I exclaimed, struck by the disturbing implications of such a theory. "Surely Dr. Marchand could not have intended such extreme interpretations of your artistic work." "He was writing a book," Moreau continued, his hands beginning to work compulsively at a paint-stained rag. "Case studies of patients who had achieved breakthrough revelations through his methods. I was to be his prime example, the artist who had learned to channel collective guilt into meaningful expression." Poirot had risen from his stool and was now examining the paintings with renewed intensity, his gray eyes moving from canvas to canvas with systematic precision. "These works," he observed. They show remarkable consistency in their imagery. Always water, always floating figures, always that quality of peaceful surrender to drowning. It haunts me, Morrow admitted, his voice growing even quieter. The image of bodies in water, faces turned toward the surface, arms spread wide as though embracing their fate. Sometimes I paint these scenes without conscious memory of creating them. Ah, Poirot said suddenly, pausing before a canvas that seemed somehow different from the others. This painting here, it appears more recent than the others. The paint, she is still fresh in places. I moved to examine the work in question, immediately struck by its photographic precision. Unlike the dreamlike quality of his other pieces, this canvas depicted the Tuileries fountain with almost documentary accuracy. Every architectural detail was rendered with meticulous care. I painted that yesterday, Morrow said, his voice taking on a strange detached quality. When I woke, I found myself at the easel with wet paint on my brushes. And this scene completed. I have no memory of creating it. Inspector Giraud leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing alert. You have no memory? What do you mean, precisely, monsieur? The night of Dr. Martian's death, October the 14th, I experienced what can only be described as a complete loss of consciousness. I retired to bed at my usual hour, but when I awoke the following morning, I was soaked to the skin and covered in mud. The silence that greeted this extraordinary revelation was profound. I found myself studying the artist's haggard features, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes, and the way his hands continued to work nervously at the paint-stained cloth. You have no recollection whatsoever of the intervening hours? Poirot asked, his tone carrying the careful neutrality I associated with his most crucial inquiries. None, Morrow confirmed, moving to stare out the great windows toward the gardens below. It was as though I had been sleepwalking, or perhaps possessed by some external force. When consciousness returned, I found my studio clothes soaked through, my shoes caked with garden soil, and this painting. He gestured toward the precise rendering of the fountain scene, completed as though by another hand. I observed. Poirot's mustaches twitched, that subtle movement indicating intense interest carefully concealed. His eyes had grown very still and watchful as he contemplated the implications of the artist's testimony. The sensation of water. He inquired quietly, when you awoke in this condition, it was as though you had been immersed completely? Exact, Morrow replied with a shudder. Every garment saturated, my hair dripping, the taste of fountain water lingering in my mouth. Yet I could remember nothing. Nothing except dreams of floating figures and the sound of ripples breaking against stone. Upon our return to the Hotel Tuileries, I found Poirot in a state of intense mental activity that I had come to recognize as the preliminary stages of his most brilliant deductions. He had arranged our sitting room into what he termed his cabinet of analysis, with 3 chairs positioned to represent our suspects, while the writing desk had been cleared to accommodate his methodical arrangement of notes and observations. Asseyez-vous, Hastings, he commanded, indicating a chair position to afford the best view of his impromptu theater. Poirot, he must now create order from the chaos of human psychology. Each of our 3 suspects presents a most fascinating study in mental disturbance. I watched with familiar fascination as my friend began his systematic review of the case. His movements possessed that peculiar precision I associated with his greatest intellectual efforts, each gesture calculated, each pause significant. Upon the desk he had arranged 3 manila folders, each bearing the name of a suspect in his characteristic neat handwriting. Consider first our Comtesse de Varenne, he began, opening the leftmost folder with ceremonial precision. A woman of rigid control, whose dreams betray violent impulses. Notice particularly her reaction when objects were displaced in her presence, the compulsive need to restore order, revealing a mind balanced precariously upon the edge of chaos. Her nightmare of drowning, I observed, occurring precisely on the night of Martian's death. Surely that cannot be mere coincidence. Non, mon ami, he agreed, his fingers drumming against the desktop. But consider the psychological mechanics. The Comtesse experiences dreams of violence, yet maintains conscious abhorrence of disorder. Dr. Marshan suggested her nightmares were suppressed memories, an interpretation she found intolerable. Moving to the center folder, Poirot continued his analysis with growing intensity. Mademoiselle Blanc presents an even more complex puzzle. Her obsession with cleanliness masks profound psychological contamination. She spoke of Dr. Marshaw himself becoming unclean, spiritually polluted by his investigations into the darker aspects of human nature. The quantities of cleaning supplies in her apartment, I added. They seemed excessive, even for someone of her obvious compulsions. Precisement. And notice her description of purification through water, the universal cleanser that washes away all contamination. She spent the entire night of the murder in cleaning activities, yet provided no witnesses to confirm this alibi. I found myself studying the evening light as it slanted through our hotel windows, illuminating the distant gardens where Dr. Marshaw had met his mysterious fate. Her religious fervor when discussing the doctor's death was particularly disturbing. She seemed to view his drowning as a form of divine justice. "Ah, oui," Poirot murmured, opening the final folder. "But it is Monsieur Marot who presents the most intriguing psychological profile. An artist whose paintings depict drowning figures with obsessive consistency, whose studio overlooks the very scene of the crime, and who awoke after the murder with no memory of the crucial hours. His complete loss of consciousness seems almost too convenient," I suggested. "Could such a condition be fabricated to provide an alibi?" Poirot's gray eyes grew very still as he considered this possibility. "The human mind, Hastings, is capable of extraordinary self-deception." Marot described himself as a vessel for collective guilt, a psychological state that Dr. Marshan actively encouraged. Such extreme identification with universal suffering might indeed produce dissociative episodes. Rising from his chair, Poirot moved to stand before the window, his reflection merging with the darkening vista of Paris beyond. Yet there remains the curious matter of his painting, that precise rendering of the fountain scene completed without conscious memory. Either Monsieur Marot possesses photographic recall of a crime scene he claims never to have visited, or he was present during the commission of the murder itself. I finished, feeling a chill of understanding. Exactment. But was he present as perpetrator, witness, or perhaps as an unconscious instrument of another's will? Poirot turned from the window, his expression grave. Dr. Marshan was experimenting with psychological manipulation, he continued, using his patient's mental disturbances for his own literary purposes. Such exploitation creates dangerous psychological pressures. I observed my friend begin to pace the confines of our sitting room, his movements reflecting the intensity of his mental processes. Each of our suspects, he went on, was encouraged by Marshan to confront their darkest impulses. The Countess' violent dreams, Mademoiselle Blanc's obsession with spiritual cleansing, Marot's identification with collective guilt, all were amplified and directed by the doctor's therapeutic interventions. You believe Dr. Marshan deliberately destabilized their psychological conditions? I asked, struck by the horrifying implications of such professional misconduct. Mais oui, Poirot confirmed grimly. His missing files contained detailed documentation of each patient's sessions, evidence of systematic psychological manipulation conducted under the guise of legitimate treatment. Someone discovered the true nature of his research and took appropriate action. Moving to his writing desk, Poirot began arranging a new set of papers, copies of appointment schedules, location maps, and timeline reconstructions that Inspector Giroux had provided. "Tomorrow morning, Hastings," he declared, "we shall visit the scene of the crime at dawn, the precise hour when Dr. Marshan's body was discovered. The fountain, she may yet reveal secrets that daylight examination has overlooked." "What do you hope to discover there?" I inquired, studying the methodical arrangement of evidence my friend had assembled. "The psychological geography of murder," he replied cryptically. Each suspect possessed both motive and opportunity, yet only one possessed the specific combination of psychological compulsion and practical capability necessary to transform thought into action. I watched Poirot extract a fresh notebook from his travel case and begin transcribing what he termed his psychological map of the case. His handwriting flowed across the pages with mechanical precision, recording observations and connections in a format that remained largely incomprehensible to my less analytical mind. "The word guilt found in Dr. Martian's hand," he continued, his pen moving steadily across the paper, "represents the key to understanding this crime's psychological architecture. Was it the doctor's final confession of professional misconduct? Or perhaps a signature left by the murderer, a psychological calling card marking the completion of moral justice?" "Surely," I ventured, "the handwriting analysis will determine whose hand inscribed that crucial word." "Ah, mon ami, but consider the possibility that Dr. Marchand was compelled to write it himself, perhaps at the insistence of someone whose psychological authority he had learned to fear. The power dynamics between doctor and patient can become reversed under extreme circumstances." As the evening progressed, I observed Poirot construct what he called his dramaturgy of guilt, a theoretical framework explaining how each suspect's psychological condition might have led to murder. The Countess' violent dreams, finding expression through drowning symbolism. Mademoiselle Blanc's purification obsession, demanding the cleansing of spiritual contamination. Marot's artistic vision, materializing into deadly reality during a dissociative episode. "Yet there remains one final element," Poirot announced as he completed his notes. "The crucial test that will separate genuine psychological disturbance from calculated performance. Tomorrow," he continued, "we shall set a trap, a psychological experiment, designed to reveal which of our suspects possesses knowledge they could have obtained only through direct participation in Dr. Martian's death." The precision with which my friend had organized his materials suggested that his famous little gray cells had already formulated a complete theory of the crime. Yet I knew from long experience that Poirot would reveal his conclusions only when he possessed absolute certainty, and even then, only with his characteristic flair for dramatic presentation. Dawn came gray and misty to the Tuileries gardens, with tendrils of fog drifting between the bare trees, like ghostly figures from Marot's disturbing canvases. Poirot had insisted we arrive at the ornamental fountain at precisely the hour when Dr. Martian's body had been discovered, claiming that atmospheric conditions might reveal details invisible during our previous daylight examination. "Regard, Hastings," he murmured as we approached the scene, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "The morning mist, she creates an entirely different psychological landscape. One can imagine how this place might appear to a mind already disturbed by guilt and obsession." Inspector Giroux awaited us beside the fountain, his tall figure rendered almost spectral by the swirling fog. In his hands, he carried a leather satchel that I presumed contained the evidence he had promised to bring for Poirot's examination. "The trap has been set, Monsieur Poirot," he announced quietly, his voice carrying easily in the hushed atmosphere of the early morning. "Your suggested rumor about recovered tape recordings has been carefully planted with each suspect. The responses they have been most illuminating." "Ah, bon inspector," Poirot replied with satisfaction, moving to examine the fountain's carved stone rim with renewed attention. "And these responses, they conform to your expectations?" "Better than I dared hope," Giroux confirmed, opening his satchel to extract a manila folder. "The Comtesse de Varenne departed Paris on the evening train to Nice, claiming urgent family business. Her maid reported that Madame packed with extraordinary haste, leaving behind personal effects she would never normally abandon. I found myself studying the fountain's dark water, noting how the morning light created shifting patterns beneath the surface. The implications of the Comtesse's sudden flight were obvious, yet something in Poirot's manner suggested he was not entirely surprised. "And Mademoiselle Blanc?" he inquired, his keen eyes tracing the fountain's architectural details with systematic precision. "Most curious," Giroux replied, consulting his notes. "She has barricaded herself in the public bathhouse on the Rue de Lappe, refusing to emerge despite our attempts at communication. The proprietor reports that she has been there since yesterday afternoon, demanding unlimited access to the facilities for what she terms emergency purification." "Très intéressant," Poirot murmured, crouching beside the fountain's base to examine something that had caught his attention. "The young woman seeks sanctuary and water, the very element that claimed Dr. Martian's life. Such psychology She reveals much about the murderer's mindset. I observed my friend's methodical examination of the fountain stonework, noting how he paid particular attention to areas that might bear traces of recent disturbance. The morning mist seemed to emphasize every carved detail, creating shadows and highlights that daylight had overlooked. "And Monsieur Moreau?" Poirot asked, rising from his crouch with evident satisfaction. "The most dramatic response of all," Giroux confirmed, with barely concealed excitement. "Your rumor reached him yesterday evening, while he was dining at a cafe in Marnes. Witnesses report that he abandoned his meal immediately and returned to his studio, where he has been painting with manic intensity ever since. The concierge believes he has not slept." "Magnifique," Poirot declared, his mustaches twitching with that subtle movement I associated with the successful springing of his psychological traps. "Each suspect has responded according to their particular form of mental disturbance: flight, purification, and artistic compulsion. 3 different manifestations of guilt under pressure." As if summoned by some predetermined signal, Inspector Giroux's assistant appeared through the morning mist, his uniform slightly disheveled from what appeared to be a hurried journey across the city. "Inspector," he called breathlessly, "Msumo has been observed leaving his studio. He appears to be carrying art supplies and is heading in this direction." The 3 of us exchanged significant glances as the implications of this intelligence became clear. I felt my pulse quicken as Poirot positioned himself strategically beside the fountain, his posture suggesting readiness for whatever confrontation might ensue. "Voila," he whispered, gesturing toward the misty pathway that led from the direction of Montas. "Our artist approaches his masterpiece." Through the swirling fog, I could discern a tall figure moving with the peculiar intensity one associated with artistic inspiration or psychological compulsion. Julien Moreau emerged from the mist like a figure from one of his own paintings, his unkempt hair wild from a night's work, his paint-stained smock billowing in the morning breeze. In his hands he carried an easel and a canvas that appeared to be freshly completed. His dark eyes held the glazed quality of one operating under extreme mental pressure, while his movements possessed the mechanical precision of sleepwalking. "Monsieur Moreau," Poirot called gently, his voice carrying clearly across the silent garden. "You have come to complete your work, n'est-ce pas?" The artist paused in his approach, his gaze moving from Poirot to the fountain and back again, with the detached interest of one observing a purely aesthetic arrangement. "The composition requires verification," he replied in a voice devoid of normal emotional inflection. "Art must be faithful to reality." I watched with growing fascination as Moreau set up his easel with methodical care, positioning it to provide an optimal view of the fountain scene. The canvas he had brought was clearly a continuation of the painting we had observed in his studio, the same precise rendering of architectural details, the same photographic accuracy of perspective. "This scene," Poirot observed, moving closer to examine the artist's work, "you have captured it with remarkable fidelity, almost as though you had observed it from multiple vantage points." "I painted what I remembered," Moreau replied, his hands beginning to work at his brushes with automatic precision, every detail exactly as it occurred: the positioning of the body, the arrangement of the clothing, the expression of peaceful surrender. Inspector Giroux stepped forward, his notebook appearing with practiced efficiency. "Monsieur Moreau, you stated previously that you had no memory of the night in question. How then could you remember such specific details?" The artist's hands paused in their mechanical movements, while his eyes grew momentarily clear and focused. "The memories returned gradually," he said slowly, as though speaking from a great distance. "At first, only fragments, the sound of water, the sensation of cold stone, the weight of wet fabric. But as I painted, the complete scene reconstructed itself." "Ah," Poirot murmured, his gray eyes growing very still and watchful. "And in this reconstruction, monsieur, were you observer or participant?" "Both," Moreau whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle sound of water flowing from the fountain. "I watched myself act as though controlled by another's will. Dr. Marchand understood, you see. He knew that I had become the vessel he had created, the perfect instrument for expressing collective guilt." The morning mist seemed to thicken around us as the full implications of this confession became clear. I observed Poirot's posture straighten with the satisfaction of a theory confirmed, while Inspector Giraud's hand moved instinctively toward the handcuffs at his belt. "The word guilt," Poirot said quietly, "written in Dr. Martian's hand. Was this his final acknowledgment of what his psychological manipulation had created?" Morrow nodded slowly, his paintbrush moving across the canvas with dreamy precision. "He wrote it willingly. When he understood what he had made of me, what his experiments had produced, he accepted responsibility. The drowning was his idea of appropriate justice, purification through the element he had taught me to worship." As the artist continued his methodical recreation of the murder scene, I found myself studying his calm expression with growing unease. There was something profoundly disturbing about the detached manner in which he described such extraordinary events, as though discussing the technical aspects of a purely academic exercise, rather than confessing to murder. The arrest of Julien Morrow proceeded with the quiet efficiency characteristic of French justice. Yet I found myself troubled by questions that his confession had raised rather than resolved. As Inspector Giraud's men led the artist away through the dissipating morning mist, Poirot remained beside the fountain in an attitude of profound contemplation, one I had learned to associate with his most complex deductions. "Mon ami," I ventured, as the sound of departing footsteps faded into silence, "surely the case is now concluded? Morrow has confessed to the murder, with details only the perpetrator could know." Poirot's gray eyes remained fixed upon the dark water of the fountain, where ripples caught the strengthening sunlight in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic in their regularity. "Has he indeed, Hastings? Consider carefully what Monsieur Morrow actually revealed. He described watching himself commit murder, as though controlled by another's will. He spoke of Dr. Marchand writing the word guilt willingly, accepting responsibility for what his experiments had produced." "The psychological explanation seems clear enough," I replied, though something in my friend's manner suggested deeper complexities remained unexplored. Dr. Martian's manipulative therapy created the conditions for his own destruction. "Precisement," Poirot agreed, turning from the fountain to face me directly. "But consider the extraordinary sophistication of this psychological architecture. Dr. Marchand encouraged each patient to explore their darkest impulses, the Countess's violent dreams, Mademoiselle Blanc's purification obsessions, Morrow's identification with collective guilt. Yet it was Morrow alone who possessed the specific combination of artistic vision and psychological fragmentation necessary to transform abstract guilt into concrete action." As we walked slowly through the awakening gardens, Poirot began to explain the intricate psychological mechanism that had produced Dr. Martian's death. The doctor's research had focused on the therapeutic value of confronting suppressed guilt, but his methods had crossed the boundary between legitimate treatment and dangerous experimentation. Each patient represented a different manifestation of guilt under psychological pressure, he continued, his voice taking on the measured tones I associated with his most profound insights. The Countess fled, the aristocratic response to intolerable revelation. Mademoiselle Blanc sought purification, the obsessive response to spiritual contamination. But Morrow experienced complete psychological fusion with his therapeutic persona. "You believe Dr. Marchand deliberately created this condition?" I asked, struck by the horrifying implications of such professional misconduct. "Mais non," Poirot replied with surprising gentleness. Dr. Marchand was himself a victim of his own psychological theories. He genuinely believed that extreme therapeutic intervention could produce breakthrough insights. What he failed to recognize was that some minds, when pushed beyond their limits, do not break, they transform. We had reached the edge of the gardens, where Inspector Giraud's motorcar awaited our return to the hotel. Yet Poirot seemed reluctant to depart, his attention drawn repeatedly to the fountain that had become the focal point of this tragedy. "The word guilt," he said suddenly, "represents the key to understanding this crime's true nature. It was neither Dr. Martian's confession nor Morrow's signature. It was both simultaneously. In that final moment, doctor and patient achieved perfect psychological unity. Marchand recognized what he had created, while Morrow provided the instrument of appropriate justice. But surely, I protested, such psychological complexity cannot excuse the act of murder. Poirot's expression grew grave as he considered this fundamental question of moral responsibility. Excuse? No, James. But perhaps we may speak of understanding rather than excuse. Morrow committed murder, yet he was also the victim of psychological manipulation so subtle that he himself remained unaware of its extent. During our return journey through the awakening streets of Paris, I found myself reflecting upon the extraordinary nature of this case. Unlike the mechanical puzzles of locked rooms or impossible alibis that typically engaged Poirot's detective skills, this investigation had required penetration into the deepest recesses of human psychology. In the missing patient files, I observed they contained evidence of Dr. Martian's experimental methods. Exactum, Poirot confirmed. Documentation that would have revealed the systematic nature of his psychological manipulation. Someone, quite possibly Morrow, during his dissociative state, recognized the need to destroy this evidence of professional misconduct. Back at the Hotel Maurice, I watched with fascination as Poirot conducted what he termed the final purification of the case. From his travel case, he extracted a small bundle of papers, photocopies of Dr. Martian's remaining notes that Inspector Guiraud had provided for our investigation. These documents, he announced, moving toward the fireplace with deliberate ceremony, represent a form of psychological contamination that must not be permitted to spread. Dr. Martian's theories, however brilliantly conceived, led inevitably to tragedy. You intend to destroy them? I asked, surprised by this uncharacteristic departure from his usual reverence for evidence and documentation. Mais oui, he replied firmly, striking a match with steady hands. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Dr. Martian's methods for accessing suppressed guilt, for manipulating psychological vulnerabilities, such information, in the wrong hands, could produce further tragedies. I watched the flames consume Dr. Martian's final theories, noting how Poirot's expression combined satisfaction with profound melancholy. The dancing light illuminated his features with shifting patterns that seemed to reflect the complex emotions this case had aroused. Justice has been served, he said quietly, as the last paper crumbled into ash. Morrow will face trial for murder. Yet the true architect of this tragedy has already paid the ultimate price for his psychological experimentation. And the other patients? I inquired, thinking of the Comtesse's desperate flight and Moiselle Blanc's sanctuary in the bathhouse. They will heal, Hastings, now that the source of their psychological contamination has been eliminated. Without Dr. Martian's continued manipulation, their natural resilience will reassert itself. Time, it heals even the deepest psychological wounds. As evening settled over Paris, I found Poirot standing once again at our window, gazing toward the distant gardens, where this strange tragedy had unfolded. His reflection in the glass seemed almost ghostly in the lamplight, while his expression held the peculiar stillness that invariably followed the resolution of his most challenging cases. You spoke earlier of justice and silence, I ventured, recalling his cryptic comments during Morrow's confession. What did you mean precisely? Poirot turned from the window, his gray eyes reflecting depths of understanding I could barely fathom. Sometimes, mon ami, the greatest justice lies not in punishment, but in prevention. Dr. Martian's methods died with him, his dangerous theories consumed by cleansing fire. The silence that surrounds this knowledge may prevent future tragedies. Yet Morrow will stand trial, I pointed out. The facts of the case will become public record. Ah oui, Poirot agreed with a slight smile. But the psychological mechanisms that produced those facts, these remain our secret. Let the world see only the surface crime, not the deeper currents of manipulation and psychological exploitation that made it inevitable. I found profound wisdom in this approach, recognizing that some truths, however accurately observed, were too dangerous for general consumption. Dr. Martian's fate served as sufficient warning to others who might be tempted to pursue similar experimental methods. As I prepared for bed that evening, I reflected upon the extraordinary complexity of human psychology as revealed by this investigation. The interplay between guilt and manipulation, between therapeutic intention and destructive outcome, had created a tragedy of almost classical proportions. Outside our windows, the lights of Paris twinkled like earthbound stars, while somewhere in the city's depths, the wheels of justice continued their ancient revolution. Yet for Hercule Poirot and myself, the true resolution lay not in legal proceedings, but in the quiet satisfaction of understanding, and in the knowledge that some dangerous secrets would remain forever silent.